me. In spite of all, I still believe we are all in this together. Yes, it's true. I believe in love. I believe in you.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Mixtape with Scott. I am your host, Scott Cunningham. This week, I have a very special guest. Let's see if you can guess their name. They're the winner of the 2012 John Bates Clark Medal, given for the best and the brightest economists under 40 by the American Economics Association. Many of those people go on to win the Nobel Prize. It already predicted another prize. This person won the 2018, or was a recipient of the 2018 MacArthur Genius Grant. That's right, Dr. Amy Finkelstein, the John and Jenny S. McDonald Professor of Economics at MIT. It is a very special event to have her on the show, and I don't want to spoil a lot, so I'm just going to say we had a great time talking. Before we talk, though, I wanted to tell you that most of the time, what we did was we talked about her life, growing up in New York City, and a somewhat serpentine path that she took from an interest in history and political science into economics, and having an experience in her first year of graduate school work in economics that I think many of us have had, where we basically think, I've made the biggest mistake of my life. I'm not supposed to be an economist. I hate this stuff. She bounced back and has gone on to be an incredibly, obviously, and a very impressive economist. There's a testimony, I think, that many of those stories that we hear or tell ourselves in graduate school are probably just that. They're just stories. And all stories are wrong, but some are useful. And the story that tells you that you're not any good at something, you have to take with a grain of salt sometimes. We talked a lot about her Oregon Medicaid experiment, which I've written about in my book, how she got into that project, how she got into health insurance and healthcare in general. But we only barely at the end had a chance to talk about her new book with Liran Einav. I'm positive that I just said Dr. Einav's name incorrectly, a professor of economics at Stanford and longtime collaborator with Dr. Finkelstein. They have a new book. We've Got You Covered, Rebooting American Health Care. We hardly got a chance to talk about it because we were just talking about so much other stuff. It's a brand new book, not really so much aimed at economists, but economists should read it. It's a book aimed at the general public because it describes general problems with our healthcare system, and it's really trying to speak to policymakers, journalists, everyday people that want to better understand the problems with our healthcare system and our health insurance, and to try to start thinking about how to better be informed in the voting booth. So I'm going to put a link below this. I highly recommend that you check it out. But if you enjoy this interview, please tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your students, tell your shaman, tell your holy man, your barista, your person that details your car, anybody and everybody. Tell them, hey, stop everything you're doing. Dr. Amy Finkelstein is on the show. Let's go watch her and listen to her. She's a fascinating person with a great story, and one that I think many of you will identify with and be encouraged by. So thank you again for supporting the podcast. I'm Scott Cunningham, the host. Well, it's a pleasure this week to have on the podcast a person that I have a tremendous amount of admiration for and have followed for a long time, Dr. Amy Finkelstein. Thank you so much for being on the show. Is it Finkelstein or Finkelstein? I should have asked you that before.
It's Finkelstein.
Okay,
like
Finkelstein.
Like Frankenstein. That's
Got it. All right. Dr. Amy Finkelstein. So for the sake of the listener, I won't ask you to repeat your name, but could you tell us your job title and who pays your salary?
I'm the John and Jenny S. McDonald Professor of Economics at MIT. So MIT pays my salary.
Okay.
I'm also the founding editor of the AR Insights Journal, so I get paid by them as well.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize you were the founding editor. Okay. You've been doing that then? How many years you've been doing that?
My second third-year term will end at the end of December.
So it's been that
for
long.
6 years, and then Matt Jenskow from Stanford is taking over.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. So I have an icebreaker. So what's a memory of a vacation that you took with your family growing up that you still kind of have noticed that will pop in your head from time to time?
Okay, this is totally embarrassing, and not profound or related to economics at all. But we took. I really like taking vacation with my family when I was a kid, and we try to do it with our kids now. But when I was about 8 or 9, we went to to Monkey Jungle in Miami,
Oh.
and I have an older brother, and a monkey shat on him. And it remains to this day the single best moment of my life. Like,
How old was your brother?
well, he's 3 years older than me, so if I was not about 9, he was probably about 12. But
Oh
sorry,
my gosh.
I wasn't expecting that question. That's honestly the first thing that popped into my head.
You still bring that up to him with like Thanksgiving and stuff?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it was more, I mean, he's over it. I'm over it. It's more like I tell my kids in terms of when we were traveling, I remind them of the
Right.
height of my travel experience.
Yeah, that's right. Like nothing, whatever, however much fun we have on this trip, it will never top what happened to your uncle.
Yeah, exactly. When a monkey shot on Uncle Jeff, there's just no talking.
There's no tell. It's all downhill. Okay, that's great. All right. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about your childhood as we move forward. So, what did your parents do for a living when you were little?
Yeah, so both my parents are academics, actually. They're both still living, so that's wonderful. They were both biologists,
Mm.
and so sort of grew up surrounded by academics and academic biologists. All their friends are biologists, just like almost all my friends now are economists. But
Yeah.
and I kind of it never really occurred to me to do anything but academia. I always really liked school. I suspected at the time, and I think that suspicion proved correct, that I'm not constitutionally well suited to any job in the real world. But the trouble for me was, I mean, I liked lots of things in school, and I certainly liked science, but I was never drawn to sort of biology or studying the natural world. I was sort of much more drawn to studying the sort of social world around me. Finding the right field, though, took me some time.
Yeah. Were your parents in the same department?
No, they're never. I grew up in New York City, and I think one of the reasons we were there is it's a place where it's relatively easier to find two academic jobs, so they were never in the same department.
Do they have the same kind of like specialization within biology, or are they like totally different?
So the way they describe it is close enough to argue. So,
okay. Okay.
Not really.
Not really.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you grew up wanting to be you grew up probably imagining, you said, to be an academic, but did you grow up kind of thinking you'd be a scientist since you weren't interested in biology?
I mean, so that's a bit of a touchy subject. I would say I am a scientist.
Yeah.
My parents would disagree.
Right.
I tell them I'm the only social scientist in the family. They're the antisocial scientists.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I had no idea. I liked school. I liked doing research papers. An embarrassing story that my husband told an economist who told it publicly, so I guess I'm only re-embarrassing myself, is my first research paper in first grade. We all had to draw mammals out of a hat and write a research report on those. And I wrote on elephants, and I liked it so much that I wanted to write another one. In fact, actually, I take it back. We must have gone to Miami. I must have been 6 rather than 9 when the monkey shot on my brother, because we had just been on this trip to Miami and the Everglades. And so I wrote a second research paper, just because I wanted to, on alligators. And the entire paper, which of course my parents saved, shows the limits of small samples. That every sentence is something like alligators, unlike elephants, live in the water. I just liked school. I liked learning things. I liked telling other people what I thought I'd learned. So
Yeah. So you weren't interested in biology, but you could imagine that you were going to be a scientist in general, because you were like, you loved and it was like there was a lot in the natural parts of it, that like the natural sciences, or not necessarily.
By far my favorite subject in high school was history.
Oh,
and I still really love history. I love reading history
mhm.
and learning. But I think when I got to college, I thought, perhaps mistakenly, that if I became a historian, I would just be learning more and more about less and less, whereas what I loved were the survey courses.
Yeah.
So I tried to find something like history, but that was a little broader rather than deeper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was it like growing up in New York City as a kid? That seems like a dream.
Yeah, I grew up in the 70s, which, actually at one point when I was interviewing in grad school for academic jobs, I was engaged at the time. So they were interviewing my husband as well, or my fiance, and someone said to me, because they imagined we were thinking correctly, that we were thinking of having kids, and they said, Manhattan is a wonderful place, to raise a family. It's not like it was in the 70s when no one in their right mind would raise children in Manhattan.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, and I have to say, I do think, I mean, I love the independence growing up there.
Yeah.
By about fifth grade or so, I could take the crosstown bus, I could take the subway, etc. But it definitely, that was shortly after, I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was shortly after the deinstitutionalization of the psychiatric hospitals. And, I remember learning at a very young age not to make eye contact with anyone on the street, not
Really?
I mean, it was sort of like at the time, it didn't, now thinking about it, it's odd. But
Yeah.
at the time, it just didn't strike, that was just what you were taught,
Yeah. You could notice the deinstitutionalization as a kid happening around you?
I noticed the change because
Yeah, you
it
can notice the
happened
change.
before me. But if I think back to my childhood relative to now, the number of people, so I grew up on between 73rd and 74th and West End, and the near our house was 72nd and Broadway, and there's a little sort of strip where you cross, and there were just large numbers of people standing there talking to themselves and occasionally talking to us. And I just remember, my parents said it, I talked to them about it when I was older. They said it was very hard for them to have to tell a child, to look away, to not talk to people, not particularly compassionate or appropriate behavior, but just as a safety matter. And I remember, I mean, it must have affected me in ways I didn't realize, because I remember as a young child, everyone has the fear of monsters or I was terrified of burglars. And it must have deeply been instilled in me, because I remember in late high school, I went on this Knowles National Outdoor Leadership School 1 month backpacking trip in the Wind River Valley in Wyoming. And at some point, so we're deep in the backcountry, and the culmination of it is they set you out in groups of 3 or 4, and you go by yourself for 3 or 4 days to find your way out. So we're even deeper, like off trail, whatever. And one night we had gotten lost, and we finally set up camp in the dark. We don't quite know where we are, but there was water nearby, and everyone's doing something. And I was sent to get water. And so I'm walking alone in the dark to the stream in the middle of, the wilderness in Wyoming. And I should have been worried about bears or whatever. But instead, I had this totally, and I knew it at the time, but visceral but irrational fear that someone was going to jump out of the bushes and mug me.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that I think probably was
you think that this is my first time to hear this kind of story. Usually the New York City story is kind of the rise in crime that happens in the 80s, but I haven't heard anybody say something about the deinstitutionalization.
Well, it was both. I was born in 73, so the crime was also, I'm sure, a lot of it. I mean,
it's all kind of mixed.
We had mugger money as kids. This was a thing that the parents believed in. I don't know that there was any evidence for it, but the view was they were concerned that if you got mugged and you didn't have any money, and most kids, I had a bus pass for the crosstown bus and I wasn't carrying any money, they were concerned that someone might be very upset and harm you if you had $20 in mugger money. Now at some point I got hungry and spent my mugger money on pizza, and I always figured it was unlikely I'd actually get mugged. B, view that I'd get hurt if I didn't have money.
Right.
There's evidence for that. And see, if I'm mugged and beaten up, are my parents really gonna get mad at me for spending my mugger money? So
right.
But I don't mean to say I was consumed with fear all the time. But now that you're asking about it.
No. Well, yeah, I remember that. I mean, I grew up in Mississippi, but I still I just now I'm wondering, even these slogans your parents would give you, or don't talk to strangers. Almost, I think like those are obviously endogenous to something around, and I just hadn't really thought that. Yeah, you saying deinstitutionalization, because I was going to talk about something along those lines later, and that just kind of that was it. That's interesting. Well,
I'm probably echoing, I was aware of people mumbling to themselves,
right,
and being robbed. And beyond that, I'm echoing probably what my parents said. I mean, they live near Lincoln Center, and my dad says, he had been in New York since, I guess, the late 50s. And he said he noticed that, like, he was at some outdoor concert at Lincoln Center at some point in the 60s and looked around and realized there were a lot of people there talking to themselves. And different than it had been. So I think he had told me about that.
Yeah. Wow. So it's high school, and I'm curious, you step foot into high school, 9th grade. You're the youngest group in the high school. What was high school like at that moment? Was it scary, or were you excited?
Well, I have to put it in context. I actually went to the same school from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's an private all-girls school. I'm incredibly grateful to my parents for sending me there. I got a phenomenal education. And so for me, the scary transition was going to college, and for the first time having to introduce myself to people, because there were 42 girls in my graduating class, and many of them had been there since kindergarten.
You knew everybody.
And even when new kids came in, they came in the context of everyone else knew me. So I was meeting one or two new people. But the idea of having to define yourself in an initial meeting was totally foreign to me.
Right. Well, so what did y'all like to do in high school because it sounds like y'all were probably pretty close, those 42, or at least some of you had some close friends. What did y'all like to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I probably worked much harder in high school than I did in college. So I did a lot of homework, and I like doing it. We often you'd be on the phone with your friends talking about the homework or whatever. I did some smattering of activities. I feel like kids these days do everything very seriously, and I did nothing. I played squash badly. I played tennis badly. The one thing I did that was a lot of fun that I wish I'd continued is I had learned to juggle. And so
more than 3 balls?
Yeah, at my peak I could do 5.
Wow.
But it's totally nonlinear. Like, I can teach 98% of the population to juggle 3 balls.
Yeah. And right. You can pick that up. That can be.
I could teach you in 10 minutes if you don't know, but I worked for a year and a half to learn 5 balls. Like, that was,
No, I've never, I have always juggled 3, and I could not. I guess it was like there was no YouTubes, but I mean, what'd you do? You had a book or something? Or you figured it out?
There were 2 things. So one, in high school, I taught the middle schoolers. I did like an after school program, help them juggling, which was fun. And then I would go down on Carmine Street. There was a juggling group that met of like adults that met Thursday nights, and I would go down and they would help, teach me. And that was really funny, because basically, as far as I could tell, at least at the time, there were 2 types of jugglers. There were like the ones that were down in the village in Carmine Street, who were kind of like these hippie people who, and juggling. And then the others, for some reason that I don't fully understand, like physicists are really into juggling. So I had learned to juggle from some physicist friends of my parents when I was like in middle school. But then
is it almost like you have to be coached? That's what I always felt like I was missing. Like, somebody's got to tell me, no, you're not doing a thing right.
Or when you're learning a new trick, and then it's a lot of practice. And that was, to me, because I played a musical instrument badly in middle school and stopped it, not only did I have no innate talent, but I never practiced. Yeah. And I felt really down on myself about that. And I thought I was, incorrigibly lazy and would never have the discipline to actually work hard at anything and improve. So I was super psyched when I discovered that, no, it turned out I just hate music. So like, I actually practiced the juggling really hard because I really wanted to get good at it. One of the key tricks that I learned from this group, so simple once you say it, is if you're going to practice, like if you want to learn 4 balls, right, practice over your bed. because then when you drop it, which you do all the time when you're learning a new trick or moves, you just don't have to lean down as far.
Yeah, exactly. They don't roll away.
Well, that's beanbags. You need to use beanbags, not
beanbags. Yeah. Right. Well, what did you dream of in high school? Are you still thinking in high school, I'd like to be a professor like my parents, or what are you now thinking about towards the end?
I think I was thinking I was excited to go to college and meet some new people and broaden the set of courses, like topics I could study. And the school I went to was phenomenal, but because it was small, and it really taught me a ton about how to study and how to learn and how to work hard. But because it was so small, there was very limited offerings. So, so I was excited to have choice of courses. I think if you'd asked me, I would have said I was interested in something in the policy space, and whether that was law or journalism or or working in Washington, I wasn't sure. I think in retrospect, I realized that, I didn't know at the time that my interest in my courses was unusual. Like, my friends seemed to like their courses too. So, but in retrospect, I think it was pretty clear that I would end up in academia.
Yes. Well, so you go to Harvard, you step foot at Harvard. What'd that feel like? Being at such a historic school for the first time. What was the feelings like?
I mean, it was super exciting. I felt, so my parents were actually quite nervous about my going there and didn't want me to go because they had heard that, the faculty are really inaccessible and, and as educators themselves and knowing how much I cared and they cared about education, they wanted me to go somewhere where, I would have a good educational experience. And actually they were wrong and they admit it. And first of all, the lecture courses I took were just phenomenal. Like, you have faculty who've prepared a lecture and maybe they prepared it 4 years ago, but like they're still giving a really good lecture. And then maybe it's just because so few students did approach the faculty. I found that without exception, when I went to faculty's office hours, which they all had, they were super encouraging, supportive, helpful, so academically, I was really pleased. And then I think it was just so exciting to meet such a broad range of kids from, across the country, from different backgrounds. I ended up spending, I'm talking about it as if, yes, I was going to be an academic and I went to Harvard and I studied really hard. But the truth is, I spent about 30 hours a week working on the weekly student newspaper.
Really?
Yeah, not the like daily one that everyone knows.
The Crimson Tide? You didn't work on you did not work on the Crimson Tide?
I worked on a weekly paper called The Independent. And it was really fun. I worked in the news department. I eventually became the news editor.
Wow.
It's really fun. I mean, but it was just, in retrospect, the time I spent on it was a little absurd, but,
what do you think that was? What about that do you think spoke to you?
Well, I think one, I really liked the other students who were doing it. They were sort of a similar mix of like, maybe the reason I went to the Independent is I was like, well, I want to have time for my schoolwork. And I had this image of the Crimson, people spent their life there. I'm not sure that was true. And there were a lot of other people like that at the Independent who were both like excited about their serious about their coursework, but also serious about putting out a good product. And then I learned that, it was fun. I got to interview, various administrators and faculty and students and, to have a lens into what was going on in campus. And then I really credited it with learning, not sure about learning how to write, but learning how to rewrite. Because it forced you had to write quickly. And then as you progressed up in the organization, you became an editor. And so someone would hand you something and your instinct was, okay, it's going to be a lot of work. So I'm going to just go in and immediately start rewriting it. And I find that made it a lot easier for me to then go take that own attitude to my own papers. Like, okay, I had a draft and now I'm coming back in as if it was, something that, a staff writer handed me and I'm going to assume it needs to be rewritten from scratch and I'm going to go in and do that. I may drive my students a little nuts because I take that approach to their drafts as well. But this idea that like what you put on the page first is not what has to stay there. No, other people, I have some co-authors who write very slowly and beautifully, and the sentences they write remain. But that maybe from my experience in The Independent, I learned to write really quickly and then to scrap it all.
Wow, that's great. Right. So did you kind of have an identity during that time where you were like, I'm a journalist? Or not really?
No, I really enjoyed it. I think the thing that I recognized that I didn't like about it is I felt that I was always playing catch up. Like that I was, some topic came up and I would talk to three people who were knowledgeable about it. And that was fun and interesting. And I learned a lot, but I had no stock of knowledge on the subject from which I could like sort of critically evaluate what they were saying as opposed to report on. Now that, you know, I talk to reporters and read what reporters write about things that, you know, I know about. I'm always incredibly impressed with, you know, I think I was wrong to think this was a feature of journalism. I think it may be a feature of college journalism or my college journalism, but the really good reporters, and there are many of them out there, it's clear that when they come to talk to me about some body of work that I know about, they're not coming in tabula rasa. They, you know, they already have some thoughts and they're open to learning more and changing their views, but they're not just, you know, a blank slate to regurgitate what I say. Whereas I felt a little bit like that, you know, when there was some issue that came up, you know, that we were writing about, you hear what the dean says and you hear what the other, you know, what the students say, and then you kind of, you know, say on the one hand, on the other hand. And
right.
So but I think it's a huge admiration I have for journalists that they clearly, you know, come in with enough knowledge to be able to sort of critically interrogate and respond to what you're saying, as opposed to just, you know, taking down, you know, your comment to report.
Right.
But yeah, I liked it. It was a lot of it's.
That's neat. That's a neat experience. Well, so, you know, a lot of the economists that I talk to, they'll say, you know, their first exposure to economics, it'll what I've been able to kind of piece together is it's either a book, it's a person, or it's a class. And I'm curious, what was your first exposure to economics for you?
I mean, so I think my first exposure was as a freshman. I took the intro economics course.
Econ 10, right?
Yeah.
10.
But I'd say but actually, so I didn't major in economics. I majored in government, or what Harvard calls political science. In part because I really liked history. And I thought of political science as a way of using history and knowledge of across time and space to sort of make sense of the world and build models of the world.
Right.
And I think it is, but there were two problems with that. One was, I think to do that well, you need to know a lot of history.
Yeah.
I didn't then, I'm not even sure I do now, but I sort of realized, well, that would take, you have to accumulate that stock of knowledge. And I was impatient at 18. I didn't want, you know, just consume knowledge for the next 20 or 30 years. So there's part of me now wish if I had, I would know a lot more. But then the other thing that happened is I, you know, as I said, my parents were scientists, and I would occasionally give them my, you know, poli-sci term papers, you know, to read. And my dad would often comment, he's like, yeah, that was a nice argument. You could have just as easily argued the other side. And I kind of thought he was right, at least at the level that I was doing it. And so I got very excited by empirical work in political science, which I think relatively new. This was the early 90s. And the idea that, you know, I know you can lie with statistics, but at some level, the idea that you could use data and rigor to try to answer questions about, you know, why certain bills had gotten passed or why policy was the way they were, how people voted, rather than just, you know, sort of make qualitative arguments. I thought it clearly was imposing discipline on me, you know, and so I ended up doing my senior thesis on empirical political science on the question of academic earmarks, actually, you know, as Congress, you know, will allocate funding for, you know, to a university for, you know, a big, you know, science project or something, and, you know, why some universities got it and not others. Guess what? It, you know, having a powerful congressman helps.
Right.
But then, and so I think though, and so I love the empirical work, but at the same time, I kind of was sort of realizing I was less interested in why the policy got enacted than
Yeah.
the impact of the policy was or what the policy should be.
Uh-huh.
And, in college, you sit around with your friends and you just, sort of these college bull sessions, you argue about, the topics of the day were things like, does welfare, cause single motherhood and intergenerational dependency? Charles Murray's The Bell Curve had just come out.
Right.
And so the really eye-opening moment for me was actually the fall of my senior year. I took a class from Larry Katz called Social Problems in the American Economy.
Yeah.
And it was just like, oh my goodness, all these questions that we were sitting around shooting the shit about, excuse my language, in our dorm room. It turned out those were questions that you could actually try to answer rigorously with data rather than with sort of just rhetorical flourishes, which, my friends were very good at.
Right.
And that just blew me away. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do, because I like to argue. I had opinions. I wanted my opinions to be more informed. And then I wanted to actually have evidence rather than just, oh, come on, no one would lock you just for, higher welfare checks, or, I don't know, that's an opinion. That's not that's not evidence. And just topic after topic in that class was something that, was in the news, or I had thought about or heard about, or that my friends argued about. And he would show us a paper in which, at the time there was a lot of, natural experiments when states changed their laws on no fault divorce, whatever it was, and that's how you could look at it. And actually, one of the things I also really remember from that course is particularly, I think it was on the question of welfare causing single motherhood, which had been a big topic in the 80s. He showed us the time series of when welfare was becoming more generous and when single motherhood went up. And he's like, yeah, the time series doesn't match. And then he showed us the cross section. And then he showed us some of what must have been sort of early natural experiment papers.
Yeah.
And again, it was this notion of, again, there's another thing I think I learned from him and continue to learn from him, because we ran to North America together for 10 years, is the idea that no single piece of evidence is ever going to be completely dispositive.
Yeah.
And so the more different ways you can interrogate the same question, both with data and with other methods, the sort of greater confidence and the richer picture and nuance you can get of the results. And I was hooked. I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do.
You felt like that was more econ than poli-sci, even though there was empirical poli-sci?
But so it may just have been what I was doing, but the empirical poli-sci that I was doing was about why laws got passed, as opposed to what was the impact. Now, because I guess I was always more interested in what the policy should be than how we got the policy.
Oh, right. Because if you think about what it should be, you're kind of referencing what impact it's having. Yeah. Right. So what happens? You take that class and then now you're thinking, I was going to do one thing with my life and now I'm thinking about a different thing.
Yeah. And so again, I think by that point, I was pretty sure I wanted to be an academic. My friends were all applying for jobs in the real world, and that seemed, having a boss and, seemed not what I wanted. In fact, I remember, just jumping ahead a little bit, I remember at some point talking to a friend of mine. I was, working hard in grad school and finding it really tough, and talking to a friend of mine who'd gone into consulting, and he was like, you have no idea how easy you have it. Like, you don't have a boss to please. You don't have, your hours are your own. And I remember at some point complaining to my dad, he doesn't get it. He doesn't get how hard grad school is. And my dad was like, no, I think he's totally right. It's so awesome. And not that grad school isn't hard, but it's so awesome precisely because you get to pick which questions you work on and you don't have a boss. I don't see why more people don't want that. So he was like, stop feeling sorry for yourself. Actually,
right.
Really nice.
Right.
But so I kind of knew I wanted to be academic, but I really hadn't done much economics. I'd taken the intro course my freshman year. I was sick my sophomore year. That
would have been Richard Freeman, or was that Mankey?
No. The intro course my freshman year was Marty Feldstein.
And
my sophomore year, I was actually pretty sick. I had a really bad case of mono. So I went on a light course load, and tried to take easy courses, so I took macroeconomics.
You took macro as the easy one? Oh
Which I
man.
didn't like. And then my senior year, in addition to taking Larry's course, because I was sort of hearing from friends that this economics thing might be something I was interested in, I took intermediate micro as well.
Oh,
but
okay.
that's all I'd had. So I really hadn't had much economics. And so I was woefully unprepared for grad school. And I was very fortunate to get a fellowship that would pay for me to study for 2 years at Oxford. And so I used that as an opportunity to do a master's in economics.
That was kind of like a correction. You were like, I'm going to do this master's to kind of fix the route a little bit.
And I felt really grateful because when I looked in the US, there just really weren't many terminal master's programs.
Right.
And I think separately, I think that's something we should probably be changing, because I think with the PhD program getting increasingly long, and some people figuring out after a couple of years that they can fruitfully and happily do something else. Why not just start with a 2-year master's in which so you can choose to go on if you want, or you can choose to have gotten a useful and degree and move on but I felt when I realized that you couldn't do a sort of typical master's in the US, I felt all the more lucky and grateful to have the opportunity to have it.
What was the flavor at Oxford? How did it differ from Larry Katz's class? I mean, is it as empirical?
No, it was night and day. And it was, in fact, so my somewhat tortured story is I got to Oxford, and after the first, after a while there, I suddenly thought, oh my God, I had this all wrong, and I don't want to be an economist. In fact, now I don't want to. I can't be an economist, because it was a heavily theoretical and math-oriented program, and I could
even at the terminal masters.
And I could do it, but it wasn't what I like math as a means to an end for me. And I got the, I think, mistaken impression while I was there that it was, that economics was a career for failed mathematicians. Like everyone seemed to be glorifying over the beauty of the proof or whatever. And it's just like, come on, where are the social problems in the American economy?
Right.
And then I sort of had a bit of a, personal/professional crisis, in the sense of I was like, okay, I decided long ago it wasn't going to be history. Then political science didn't work for me. Now economics isn't working for me. I keep thinking I want to be an academic, but like I don't have
you're running out of ideas.
And I really didn't know what to do. And some friends suggested I try legal academia, but it was too late in the cycle to apply to law school. So I needed to find something to do for a year while I applied to law school. And again, friends of mine who had done this suggested, well, look, you're stopping doing economics. It would be nice to have like a capstone experience where you use economics. You have to do something for a year while you apply to law school. Why don't you get a job in DC, as a junior economist? And I thought, anyway, like policy, I thought that would be interesting. So I applied for, and I got a job at the Council of Economic Advisors as a very junior staff economist, working actually under Janet Yellen. So I went to do that for a year and applied to law school, thinking that I would, at the end of the year, go to law school. And that was transformative in terms of my interest in economics.
So what happens? What happens there?
Well, I think the main thing that happens, so the way the Council of Economic Advisors works is that as a staff economist, I was working for senior economists who were on leave for a year or two from academia to advise, the White House on economic policy. And the first thing that happened is that I realized very quickly that the people I worked for were way better at their jobs than I could be at their jobs. So I'd had a bunch of internships in college where I thought, perhaps mistakenly, but at least it was my impression of, I could kind of do my boss's job. Maybe I need a year of experience, but I kind of know how to do that, or I could do it. And these economists had a framework for when they were posed a policy problem, that got handed down, from the president's, domestic policy council, or from the Treasury Department or the Labor Department, or sometimes from Congress. They had a framework for how you go about thinking about the problem that I didn't have. Like I remember one example President Clinton was they were trying to do something to subsidize childcare for low-income families. And there was a proposal coming out of, I think, a Republican, I don't really remember, in Congress that was going to subsidize loans to childcare providers.
Okay.
To build more childcare. And they were like, that's how we'll help low-income families. And so the Council of Economic Advisors was asked, what do we think of this?
Yeah.
And the person I was working for very quickly laid out, well, okay, depends on the elasticity of supply. And, just sort of like and then of course you have to put numbers on it, but you forget the numbers first. Like, what is the frame? How do we go about?
That's the framework. Yeah.
And I just was like, wow, all the economists that I work for, and also I met I worked with or worked for a number of economists, professional full-time, economists in DC at the Treasury Department, at OMB, and they just had such a coherent and useful set of tools for how to take the policy proposal come up and break it down into, here are the 6 things we need to know to think about the impact.
Yeah.
And I was like, I want that. I want to be able to do that. And
you're getting this framework. It's theoretical, but it's very different than the theoretical framework you were getting at Oxford a little bit.
I think in retrospect, it's closer to price theory. Right?
Yeah. That's what it sounds like.
It's just it's something that I try really hard with my students, and I'm not sure I'm successful, which is I feel like the goal is you should be able to read an article in the newspaper, and I try to take some of my exam questions from things that I've read in the newspaper over the term and be like, here's this current policy debate or current policy proposal. Just how do we lay out a framework for thinking about this as economists?
Yeah, right.
And so I was sort of like, gosh, that is so powerful. And so my desire to be an academic wasn't an academic per se. It was, I like thinking about the world and explaining what I've learned. Yeah. And I thought, okay, I guess academic economics is never going to be for me because it's highly mathematical and sort of putting a premium on mathematical advances. But I love these frameworks, and I want that. And everyone I've worked with who has that has a PhD in economics, whether they're on leave from academia or a professional economist working in DC. So I guess I will go get my PhD after all. I'm probably not going to be good at this research thing because that seems to be this other thing that I don't like as much. But at least, I'll get all the tools that these people I'm currently working for have.
Oh, the research thing is like Oxford. It's the theoretical proofing and stuff like that.
I guess I hadn't really done much empirical work.
Yeah.
I can do it. I can learn the theory. I can do the problem sets. But I'm going to do it as a means to an end of learning these economic models, which I can then take and apply in the real world. And if I can't apply them in research, I'll go apply them to policy analysis, working in DC for for the government.
Yeah.
So that was kind of where I thought I was headed when I went to grad school. And then it turned out there was this whole thing called empirical research, which I kind of had experienced in political science, just with a different set of questions. And I just loved it.
So from the moment you get to MIT, you're sort of living, you're living in a full-blown, empirical economics, and even really the credibility revolution stuff too. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and I guess somewhat relatedly, because I'd taken a lot of the first year courses at Oxford, I could place out of them, and so I was taking. I remember my fall, I had Jim Paterbo's public finance class and then Sarah Allison's industrial organization class. And they were just, that was just much more, again, applied. And sometimes, especially in IO, sometimes the math could get sophisticated, but it was a means to an end. And that was fine. I either knew it or was delighted to learn it. It was just all in the purpose of an applied problem, whether it's, what's the profit maximizing, two-part tariff for amusement parks, or what happens when you raise income taxes, what happens to women's labor supply, whatever. They were applied problems.
So when does this health care really hit you in the heart? Where's that?
So it was a little bit circuitous. I would say that I left the Council of Economic Advisors, and one of the great things about being a very junior person there as I was, this Council of Economic Advisors has the same scope in terms of its portfolio as the Treasury Department, but the Treasury Department has you know, tens of thousands of employees, but even of professional economists. And, the council, when I was there, maybe had 40 or 50 of us. And so if you're, young and like me, eager and single and had no life and wanted to work all the time, you got to work on all kinds of different things that came up. And so when I thought back over my year there, it was an amazing experience of like, what were the things that I had most enjoyed working on? It had been natural disaster insurance and automobile insurance. And
it would have been insurance.
Common denominator was insurance, because this was a setting where, Adam Smith's invisible hand or the fundamental welfare theorems didn't obviously apply.
Yeah.
And there might be scope for welfare improving government.
Yeah.
My first love was insurance.
And
I'm a little embarrassed to say that I only really started working on health insurance in particular because it seemed like there was good data and good policy variation.
Yeah.
And I'd like to say that, at some point you can't work on health insurance and not get interested in actual healthcare delivery and health. But I fear I might have if it weren't for the influence of John Skinner, who's a professor at Dartmouth. Ironically, he was visiting Harvard my sophomore year when I was sick and therefore taking macro as a easy course. And he was my macro professor. And so I assumed he was a macroeconomist. And then I started seeing at these public finance conferences talking about healthcare.
Yeah.
And he was just always talking about the inefficiency of the U.S. healthcare sector and what could be done, what was behind it, and what could be done to improve it. And I don't think he ever quite said directly to me because he's way too kind a person, but by, I think, his inspiring example, I kind of got the message of like, why are you just like mucking around with the insurance aspect of health insurance? What about the health and the healthcare delivery aspects of healthcare? So at some point, I made a transition that was important to me and probably imperceptible to everyone else from an insurance economist who happened to work on health.
You remember it though.
Yeah. Totally.
You remember going, I'm pivoting.
Yeah, I remember because what I realized I had to do was start working with actual healthcare data and started working with Medicare data. And that was a very steep learning curve.
Right. So that's a huge investment, right?
I was on
huge fixed cost investment.
Yeah, I was on leave the year I really made that switch. I was on leave at the University of Chicago, 2010, 2011. Like, this insurance stuff is interesting, but I was also, to be honest, kind of running out of ideas on that. And every time I say I work on health insurance, people tell me, "Oh, you're a health economist," and I say, "No, I'm an insurance economist." And my husband would say, "You say that as if people are going to find that more interesting."
Yeah, that's not that clarification's not clear to a lot.
Just really, the truth is, in a different life, I find lots of things in economics interesting. And one of the great things about being an economist is, although most of us specialize because there are returns to specialization, you get to advise students and go to seminars on a huge range of topics. And I find, the work my colleagues do on, inequality, on trade and labor markets, on education, those are all fascinating and important. And so, you could have spun the wheel, and in a different life, I could have just as happily done any of those. But that's how now I'm sort of all healthcare all the time.
Well, so I write about this, the Oregon Medicaid Experiment in my causal inference book. And so I'm curious a little bit. I mean, the Oregon Medicaid Experiment is one that I just, if I had heard about that, I would have just been like, well, who do I have to kill to get on that project? But like, what was it like? When you learned, what was it like? Like, how did that come about? And what was, for you in your involvement, did you learn about it first, or what was the deal?
Yeah. So, and so if you remember, in grad school, and this was still very, we learned about the Rand health insurance experiment.
Yeah. Right.
And the view was, but that'll never happen again. That was, I think in today's dollars, over 300 million.
Yeah. Right.
Because they're the government, it was a researcher designed government funded prospective study where they designed the insurance contracts, et cetera. So you have that'll never happen again, but obviously that would be amazing.
Yeah.
At the same time, right, because the Oregon experiment was 2008. So I'm back at MIT as a faculty member, and I have all these development economists running experiments.
Yeah.
But colleagues, but it's not really being done in healthcare in the US at all. And then Oregon decides to run a lottery to allocate a limited number of Medicaid slots.
Who hears of that first? Are you the one that hears of that first?
Yeah, well, Stephen Colbert lampoons it on late night TV. There's a great clip that I like to play for my students. I mean, I won't even try to imitate it because he's much funnier than I am, needless to say. But because it is, kind of absurd and a sad statement about U.S. health policy. But where he saw absurdity and humor, I don't disagree with that. But I was like, oh my God, they're running a lottery. And I was sitting at the NBER at the time, and Kate Baker had an office a couple down from me, and I just ran into her the next morning and was like, we need to get on this. And we just started,
So you told her, you were like, Colbert did this thing and they're going to do a lottery in Oregon to, randomize people to medic.
We were kind of behind we were a little scrambling to catch up. They'd already run the lottery and they were starting to announce the winners. And Kate and I had several years before worked together on a failed empirical project that went nowhere. But I knew from that I liked working with her, that she was, super smart and serious and well organized and, fun to work with. So I had no idea what I was getting into.
What'd you do? You call, it's like, you call these people on the phone and you're like, I want to analyze your data, because they're not probably thinking of it in a researcher way, right? They're not thinking we have a lottery.
We got connected with people in the state. So there was a nexus of researchers at universities who were working, with the state to try and improve their policy. And so it turned out someone there had applied for, and I think actually been rejected, but for a small grant to try to study this, the lottery, because, we weren't the only people to recognize that it was a value.
Other people watched that Colbert show.
Yeah, but I think, but they were extremely generous. This was Bill Wright and Heidi Allen, and they were extremely generous at saying to me and Kate, wow, if you guys have energy and ideas, and in particular can bring in a lot of funding, so that, they were going to try and raise money to do some small scale surveys. And
was that where the money has to come in? The money has to come in for the surveys, these big surveys?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, yeah. So in the end, we ended up doing both mail surveys, which were expensive but not astronomical, and then we ended up organizing and running about a year and a half into the lottery about 12,000 in-person interviews and physical health exams, and that was the logistical. And then
because you're like taking blood and stuff.
Yeah, and then we also ended up getting a lot of administrative data, which didn't have all the kinds of non-response concerns, subjective reporting that you worry about in some of the surveys. So we tried to get at it from all angles, and it was a great team of researchers, both in Oregon and across the country. Also a big partnership with the state government. It was a huge undertaking. I'm not sure if I had known at the time what I was getting into.
It's incredible. It's like, I love these stories of all the shoe leather. I mean, when did you bring Dr. Gruber back in? I mean, because he had been your advisor from
I think very early on. We just, I guess, in retrospect, I think we just were like, we brought both John and Joe Newhouse in very early, because I think we had the sense that, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and more heads are better than fewer. And we wanted to.
You just put together this dream team.
Yeah. It was great. Joe kept saying he was, reliving his youth through the Rand health insurance experiment. In fact, one of my favorite moments, we actually mentioned it in the book we just wrote, because it came up, it was relevant there too, is so we applying for these big NIH grants to get, funding to, or maybe it was a foundation grant. We applied for a lot of grants to get funding to do the work. And one of the reports, maybe it was a foundation actually, one of the reports we got back from a reviewer, their main concern, so this was, we're probably applying in early 2009. And their main concern is Obama has just been elected. We're about to get universal coverage. It's a question of what is the impact of expanding health insurance to low-income individuals, may be of intellectual interest, but it's going to soon be irrelevant from a policy perspective. And therefore, there's not a lot of money. And I went to Joe and I'm just like, what do I say to this? Like, I don't know how to respond to this. And he's like, we got the same comment in the 70s when we were applying for funding for the health insurance experiment that, Nixon's about to get universal health insurance coverage. So what's the point? I was like, great, that'll be my response. Right?
Oh, wow. Well, so what did you learn from it that you sort of one thing or a couple of things that you just were like, man, I was not expecting to learn this from that whole process, that whole project?
Do you mean in terms of the results or in terms of the process of doing the research?
Well, you can say either one. I'm curious, what was the biggest learning experience for you?
The biggest learning experience for me, which actually was the inspiration behind my decision to co-found J-PAL North America with Larry Katz, was, oh my gosh, despite being at that point, a tenured professor with a fair amount of research experience, there's an enormous amount of decision points and craft that go into conducting a well-designed and conducted randomized experiment that A, I didn't know, B, it wasn't obvious, except that I was fortunate enough to have my colleagues at MIT in development who were doing randomized experiments, and Larry Katz down the road at Harvard who had done MTO. It wasn't clear how I would learn those sort of soft skills. And this was the most terrifying part to me, you only got one chance.
Yeah. Because
unlike any other study where if I go give a seminar and people tell me I've been analyzing the data all along,
you still got the data. You just go.
It's a bummer. It's a waste of 2 years' life, but I can go back and redo it. And this was if I don't do things now, I've just baked in a problem. And I hadn't realized that. And I was enormously grateful to the help I got particularly from Larry Katz, also from S2E32, and from Husband, who is not only my colleague, but also my husband. So he got, he's a development economist. He got pestered with, does randomized trials, a lot of questions. One he failed me on that I teased him about is, I'd be talking to him and Esther a lot. And I finally went and talked to Larry Katz, and he's like, all these surveys, you got to be worried about non-response bias. You really need to both bake into the design some intensive follow-up, but also get administrative data so you can check where you can get similar outcomes if you have a problem. And I went home and I said to Ben, how could you not have brought this up? This seems like so first order. And he's like, I don't know. In an Indonesian village, you go survey people, 99% of people show up. Don't blame me. So I realized two things. One, that I was incredibly fortunate to have this sort of kitchen cabinet of people who were both skilled and knowledgeable and generous enough to advise me. Yeah. But also that some of these issues were unique to the North American context, they weren't the same. And so out of that was part of the inspiration to start J-PAL North America, so that other people at universities across the country could sort of, benefit. We could leverage the sort of stock of knowledge that we have and make it easier and more feasible for other people to do randomized.
Oh, it's so exciting. That's so cool. You've got this new book with, I don't know how to say the first and the last name of your co-author, Liran Einav.
I say Liran Einav, but I'm not sure I'm saying it right either.
You've written a ton with him. I was counting it, 2 books and 30 articles, and then I just quit counting. So you guys are, I'm going to take it, that's it's been a very good a good partnership.
I can't speak for him. I would say it's probably the single best professional experience of my life.
That's great.
I don't like to pay him compliments, but hopefully he won't listen to the podcast.
He won't listen to it. He won't know.
For him is amazing.
Well, what is this book about? For the sake of the listener, why'd you guys write it, and what's it about?
So, the book came out of the fact that, despite, as we've talked about, my interest in policy and the fact that a lot of the work that Liran and I do together and that I've done with other people is related to health policy and how to improve it. Neither of us have ever been involved in public policy or advising campaigns or speaking out on what policy should look like. And I think it's because we thought we didn't know, and we should stick to our narrow academic comfort lane and leave the big picture problems to people who, thinking hard and working on that. Yeah. But as we say in the prologue to the book, my father-in-law asked me during the 2019 Democratic primaries, what I thought of Medicare for all, or what I thought we should do for health policy in the U.S. And I told him the truth, which was, I don't know. Those are hard questions, and that's why I work on them. I do research on things I know the answer to.
Yeah.
I do research on things I don't know the answer to. And, my father-in-law is a very sweet man, but he's persistent. And he came back to me. He's like, look, Amy, you like to stay carefully on what the evidence is and not sort of pontificate or views on things, on facts not in evidence. But come on. You've been working on this problem for 20 years. You must be one of the world's experts on health insurance policy. Now he's, forgiven for a little father-in-law over generosity.
Sure.
But he's like, are you seriously telling me you have nothing to say about how we design U.S. health insurance policy? And I thought, ouch, he's got a point there. And it would be nice to at least, again, going back to those economists in Washington who would give us frameworks for how to think about a problem. Maybe I don't have the answer, but I at least could have a framework about if you believe A, B, and C, you'd want to do X. And if you think more about, Q, Y, P, you do, Z or something. And so
the audience is not just economists. It's like you're wanting policymakers and journalists and people like that, you're wanting to talk to them about, well, this is sort of from our career of working on these topics, this actually is more practically, the kinds of policies that we think actually are not effective. Is that wrong?
I mean, the audience is most decidedly not economists. I think it's interested people like my father-in-law who want to understand how we could potentially make U.S. health insurance coverage so much better. And it's even more particularly people who are currently involved in policy or might be thinking about going into a career in policy, so that, when a policy window opens up next to have radical health insurance reform, as it seems to at the federal level every few decades in the U.S. and perhaps more often at the state level, we have now a view of, what needs to be done, and hopefully that'll be useful.
I was kind of wanting more time to talk to you about one particular topic, but that's covered in the index a couple of times, is mental health care. And your comment at the very beginning about watching deinstitutionalization happen. I just was kind of curious, before we get off, lots of times when we have mental illness in the family, we have schizoaffective disorder in the family, and then PTSD and other things. And to navigate to be like a PhD economist, or even like, quasi health economist, and to navigate mental hospitals as a family member, you feel so weirdly incompetent, it's just incredibly like, you're like, what am I doing here? That I can't help. And, this family member doesn't want to take any other medication. But I'm curious, so you'll tell people oftentimes, like you'll tell the story of the things you've witnessed, and they'll just kind of have this reaction, which is like, why do we hate our mentally ill so much? Or why are we so bad at caring for our mentally ill? And it's kind of like this like response of judgment. But everything I experienced was like, I'm not around anybody that hates mentally ill people. It's something much deeper than that. It must be a bigger problem to solve, that these people that I'm talking to think that it's just a lack of compassion. And I'm curious, like, in your career of working on this, if you think about the mentally ill, particularly the severely mentally ill, how broken, what would you say? Is it more broken, or are there missing design problems that you've thought about that, are not something that is currently being discussed or anything like that? I'm just curious your thoughts.
I think it's newly growing area in economics. Colleagues of mine like Frank Schellbach, who works on the psychological lives of the poor in developing countries. Really interesting work recently. Catherine Neckel did something, smoking cessation and its impacts on mental health. I feel like it's a problem that needs and is getting more attention.
Yeah.
I think understanding the issues, it's not, as with many things in healthcare, but particularly with mental health, it's not going to be enough to just focus on economic incentives to patients and providers, but understanding some of the psychological models behind. I mean, it comes up obviously in mental health, but even with physical health and understanding medication adherence decisions. And I think people are doing a lot of great work, and we're making progress there. But our book actually very deliberately focused only on health insurance reform and not on care delivery.
Yeah.
There, I think we have more questions than we have answers. Which is why, despite having now said I think I know what to do about U.S. health insurance policies, I'm not going to work on that anymore. I think there's still a lot of work. I'm hoping to do some of that. There's much more on how to improve the delivery of healthcare, particularly but not exclusively, mental health care and also physical health care.
Yeah. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I promised you that I would not keep you too long. I have one last question. If you could go back to now, I guess now I'm going to change it a little bit. If you could go back to that younger Amy Finkelstein that was at Oxford, maybe that, she's kind of at her lowest point, and you could go back and she doesn't recognize you necessarily, but you go back with her and you take her out for drinks and you just sit with her and you listen to her story and you comfort her, and you can only really tell her one thing. What do you think? What do you think now that you've lived this life? What do you think you really wish you could tell her? That about where she was.
I think I know what I tell her. It's what I imagine myself telling my kids when they're a little older and going through something similar. And I'm sure, maybe it'll help them. I'm sure it wouldn't have helped her, which is just to say, be a little patient. Just because right today you no longer see your clear, 25 years forward professional path doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I think for me, what was really hard at Oxford was, I was perfectly happy day to day. I liked my courses and, I liked working at CEA, but there was this just looming, cloud of worry over my head of what is my life going to be like? And I can't see the path forward. And I think the right advice is just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and won't be pleasurable. Right. And so just, keep doing what you're doing and not to worry so much in the meantime. I'm sure I wouldn't have listened. I'm sure I don't listen now, and whatever my current worries are, people say probably something similar. But I do think, it's not like you shouldn't think at all about, do I think I'm moving forward in life? But I think I was just too consumed with, I don't know, I can't see what my career is going to be like in 20 years, and therefore that must mean there's no professional path for me, as opposed to, often, I think it's true in research as well. I've gotten much more comfortable with it in research, but unlike your career, which you only get to really live once, research you cycle. So every few years you're starting new projects and gotten much more comfortable with the uncertainty. You have some sense of where you're going. What I always say about a research project is you have to go in with some idea. Otherwise you're totally, casting about with no direction, but you can't be too wedded to the idea because inevitably other things are going to happen, and you got to sort of go where the results are going, and that may mean changing the project entirely. And I guess that's what I would say to my younger self about thinking about your life career. You need to have some guess at the moment of where you're going, but you should have a healthy realization that probably it's going to end up very different from what you're imagining at the moment, and that's not just okay. That's kind of part of the fun.
Yeah, that's part of the adventure, kind of being not being so upset by that uncertainty.
Yeah.
But still be going forward.
That's why I was so drawn to insurance, because I don't like uncertainty.
Yeah, right.
It bothers me so much when insurance markets don't work, because they're supposed to offer security.
Right. Well, it's been so pleasurable, so nice to meet you in person, as I really did mean it. I'm such a huge fan and look up to you a lot. And I think, one of so many people that just have a tremendous amount of admiration and see you as a role model. So I really appreciate you being on the podcast. And I hope that
That's
we'll cross
awesome.
in person and
Oh.
I get to meet again.
I'd love to. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Gonna see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need you.